there is a very close relationship between the way a person thinks, the way a person talks, and the way a person acts. If one can change any one of them, then he can influence the other two. The difference between defeat and victory may depend upon our thinking or our talking or our actions. I want us to consider some examples this morning from the Bible and in our lives as well, where the language used was a primary factor in the defeated lives which we find. Then hopefully we can make some application of these things. The first example to consider is the language of defeat spoken by the Israelites. In Exodus chapter 14 and verse 12, we find a group of fearful, faithless Israelites who saw the Egyptians marching after them. Exodus chapter 14 and verse 12 says, "Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." There are two things in this statement of defeat that are especially significant in terms of our study. First, the stated equivalent of, "We told you so." Before the Israelites left Egypt, they had it made up in their minds that they would fail. And nothing had happened as yet to change that thinking. Psychologists sometimes call this a self-fulfilling prophecy. This language of defeat is heard when a person looks at a program that is designed for the advancement of the cause of Christ and the progress of the gospel, yet that person says, "It won't work. It just will not work." Many times then, the subconscious mind gets in tune with these words and they see to it that it will not work. Then when some aspect fails because of opposition or indifference, that phrase comes out, "I told you so." A second and maybe a more significant aspect of the language of defeat is hidden in the last part of Israel's statement. They said, "It would have been better for us to have served the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Almost invariably, the language of defeat is a result of reacting to false assumptions. It usually works like this. A person sees some facts. He or she assumes the facts seen by them are all of the facts that are relevant. He or she assumes some things about the facts he or she sees. Then he or she reacts to the assumptions about the facts as if they were the facts. Applying this to the nation of Israel coming out of Egypt, note first some facts. They were in bondage in Egypt. They were being mistreated and killed by the Egyptians. They cried unto God, who attended to their cry and performed miracles that led them to be released. They then fled, but Pharaoh changed his mind and followed after them in pursuit. They came to a sea in front of them and an army behind them. Then they began to make assumptions. Note the assumptions. God may be powerful enough to do signs and wonders, but He is not powerful or loving enough to save us now. There is no way out of this problem. We will die in the wilderness. What a group of blind, unfaithful assumptions. Yet we see the same kind of reasoning operating in and out of the church today. Usually when I've heard preachers talk about this passage from Exodus, they have emphasized the point that the Israelites were failing because they lacked faith. That is true, and we do not want to negate that. But the principle about which we are studying is more fundamental to the facts. It has a broader application as it relates to God and man. Thus, we need to recognize three things. One, we cannot know all the facts about everything. The Israelites saw that there was no way out based upon what they knew, the facts that they had. But the facts they did not have, that which God would perform in parting the Red Sea, they did not have. Number two, we may be misapplying the facts that we do have. The facts they had, see in front of them, army of the enemy coming behind. There's no way out of this, therefore we will die in the wilderness. They misapplied the facts they had, for God had it in His plan to part the sea, allow them to walk through on dry ground, and then to close the waters again on the enemy. Number three, the third thing we must recognize is that we may be reacting to our assumptions about the facts as if they are the facts. Their reaction to their facts when they were viewing those assumptions as the facts was to say, we will die in the wilderness. A second example of the language of defeat was uttered by Moses. Even before the Israelites said, in effect, we told you so, in Exodus chapter 14, Moses had done the same thing back in Exodus chapter 4 in verse number 1. When God called to Moses from that burning bush and asked him to lead the Egyptians out of bondage, Moses replied, as worded in the English Standard Version, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" Some say that when Moses gave this excuse, this escape path for himself, that he lacked confidence in others and he lacked confidence in God. Now that may be true, and certainly his knowledge of the brethren would cause a lack of confidence in them. Yet the principle that caused the lack of confidence caused him to speak and to act as if they were defeated before he ever began is deeper than that. Notice what Moses did. Moses saw some facts. He saw the Israelites and the way they had been behaving, their faithless attitude at times. He made the assumption that they would not follow him because of their blindless faith. And then he spoke and acted as if those assumptions were the facts. If those assumptions were the fact, Moses had no business leading Israel out of Egypt. If they would not follow after Moses, then what would be the purpose of going to them? And so he spoke with God and said, "They will not listen to my voice. They will not believe me. They will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" But consider this for a moment. From the character and previous actions of the Israelites, did Moses have the right to assume that they would probably be a faithless and perverse generation? If you look back at Genesis chapter 47 and verse 15, the Israelites made a statement that would lead you to believe so. He may have also based this idea upon what was said to him in Exodus chapter 2, verses 13 through 14, when he was asked very pointedly, "Who made you a leader? Who made you to tell us what to do?" He had a perfectly good sentence, though. One from a structural standpoint that had a subject, had a predicate, and could be diagrammed and analyzed, etc. But though all the analysis be done upon it, if any one thing is left out of this that is very significant, it is that Moses had a problem. Moses had the problem that he was making a statement of an assumption as if it were fact. Do you realize the difference in what his response probably would have been if he had said, "Suppose they do not believe me, what shall I then do, Lord?" Are you able to see that instead of having a defeatist attitude and giving excuses for why he should not go, he would have instead counted the cost. He would have considered the possibilities and begun preparing to overcome the difficulties with the help of God. Look at another statement of Moses that is the language of defeat, but in a slightly different category. The Lord answered this first excuse of Moses, so what did he do? He had another excuse. Because he was accustomed to the psychology that leads to this language of defeat. He said in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 10, "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you have spoken to your servant. For I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." This is a statement of fact. Moses probably was not as eloquent as others, but it is especially dangerous because it has some hidden assumptions behind it. Note some of these assumptions with me. Moses assumed that eloquence is a necessary prerequisite of leadership. Well, I can't lead. I can't study the Bible with someone. I just don't know what to say. Are we using the excuse of Moses? He also assumed the people would not follow unless persuaded by eloquence. In other words, whoever this leader is, they need to be able to say the exact right thing in the exact right way in every situation, in every circumstance, and make it very flowery to encourage them to follow. Otherwise, they won't. He assumed that one must be eloquent in order to do God's work. God called Moses to go to Egypt. God called upon Moses to lead the Israelites out. God was going to be a part of this work. God was going to see to it that it succeeded. But Moses assumed he had to be eloquent to do the work of God. Moses also assumed that God, who made his tongue, either could not or would not make his tongue as eloquent as it needed to be. Moses assumed that God would not provide him with the talents and abilities that were needed to lead the people, if in fact it was needed, an eloquent tongue, that is. When we call this a lack of faith, we are correct. But if we can see the principles behind the situation that caused the lack of faith, we have a deeper appreciation of how to respond to the circumstances of life that may defeat us. Another example of the language of defeat was voiced by the Israelite spies. In Numbers chapter 13, when they sent out the 12 spies into Canaan, 10 of them came back with the statement. Generalizing that statement, they said, "They are giants, they are stronger than we are. In our own sight, we are as grasshoppers, and so are we in theirs." Again, this is very dangerous, for the facts are mixed up with assumptions, and all of them are reacted in the same fashion. We could say it was a lack of confidence in self and in God. But there's an even greater lesson that is almost invariably true in the language of defeat that is spoken here. Note again some of the assumptions, reacted to as if they were facts. The people assumed giants without God were stronger than they were with Him. The Israelites assumed God, who defeated Pharaoh at the Red Sea, could be defeated by giants. They assumed that they were grasshoppers in the eyes of the giants, based upon their assumption that they themselves were grasshoppers to the giants. All of these were false assumptions. And because of things and those kinds of things like it, they failed to enter the promised land. But there were many others who spoke the language of defeat. Even the great prophets like Elijah used the language of defeat. In 1 Kings chapter 18 and chapter 19, he used the language of defeat. But we can be encouraged in the fact that God was patient and enabled Elijah to overcome. Elijah made assumptions based only on what he could see. He said in 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 10, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with a sword. These things were true based on what Elijah was able to see, but it led him to make assumptions. He went on at the end of verse 10, the same thing repeated in verse 14, to assume things about the assumed facts. He said, I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Elijah saw some facts, that he appeared to be alone in facing the prophets of Baal. He assumed that he alone was left because they had killed all of the other prophets. What was his reaction then? He spoke the language of defeat and said, I alone am left. What did he choose to do as an action? Run and hide in a cave. Verse 9 of 1 Kings 19. But there are others, even in the New Testament, who spoke this language of defeat. In fact, Jesus gave parables that indicate the same kind of failure and consequences. In Matthew chapter 25, the man with 1 talent used the language of defeat. He said in Matthew 25, verse 25, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have that which is yours. He made some assumptions based upon the facts which he saw. He recognized his master to be a hard man. He recognized his master would reap where he did not sow and gather where he had scattered no seed. He made the assumption, though, that his master would not be pleased with him if he did not prosper and develop something greater. He made the assumption that his master would be more satisfied with receiving back that which he had given than to have lost it all. Based upon these assumptions, then, what did he do? His action was to dig a hole and to bury his talent. So when the master returned, he gave back to the master exactly what he had received. But what was the result then of the language of defeat? This man lost the 1 talent he had been given. Verse 28 of Matthew 25. What about the parable which Jesus spoke about the praying Pharisee in Luke chapter 18? It's another parable on this topic. The Pharisee himself assumed that he was more righteous than the tax collector. Believing this to be a fact, he assumed his actions would declare him to be righteous. All of the things which he did or the things he did not do. In reaction to these false assumptions, then he prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. What I do is I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. Luke 18, verses 11 through 12. But what was the end result of this language of defeat? Jesus pronounced which one went to his home justified rather than the other. And it was not the Pharisee. It was the tax collector, who wouldn't so much as lift his eyes towards heaven as he beat his chest and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. In Acts chapter 24, Hunter read for us the account concerning Felix. Felix spoke the language of defeat. We usually just say that Felix procrastinated, and yes, that is true. But note the same features that we've mentioned several times here today. He assumed that he would have another opportunity. He had called upon Paul several times, bringing him out of prison to hear him speak. And on this occasion, Paul spoke to him the things concerning righteousness, the righteousness of Christ, the righteousness of God. And in so doing, he assumed that he would have another opportunity. He assumed the other opportunity would be more convenient. Next time I'll be in a better situation. It'll be a better timing for me. Things will just be all around better. He assumed that he would want to obey then, even though he did not now. Paul, I don't want to respond now, but I want to hear you again. Maybe next time I'll want to obey. What was the action then that came from this thinking and this talking? Felix chose to send Paul away. Go away for now, and I'll call you at a more convenient time. In all of these cases, and many more that can be found within the pages of the Scriptures, the language of defeat is the language that makes assumptions, whether overt or hidden, and then reacts to them as if they are the facts. Most of us who have done very much personal evangelism has had someone state in various ways, I could not live the Christian life if I started. They know some facts. They know that it is easy to sin. They discern that it is hard to do right. And they realize just how often they have failed. However, they have left out some of the most significant facts concerning Christ, the power of the gospel, His promises to strengthen, to aid, and to forgive. And based upon those assumptions, they have acted and spoken as if their assumed facts are the facts. Then they have made the assumption that it's just not time. They've acted upon that assumption, and those assumptions as being fact, to put things off, to wait until another day, another time, another place. As a result, they were defeated before they began, and thus they are still living a life that is spiritually lost. Persons who have been those who are convicted of grievous sins have said, I just have too many strikes against me. Whether they were thinking this in terms of that they had done so many bad things that they could never be forgiven by God, or whether they were thinking along the lines that they had done so many bad things that they could now not overcome the sinful habits, really makes no difference. The principle behind the language is still the same. It's the language of defeat. It's based upon assumptions. It's the language we're trying to emphasize today. The language of defeat almost invariably follows this format. Something is assumed. The assumption or assumptions, there may be more than one, are spoken of then as fact and spread to others. The action or actions that are performed then are based upon the assumptions as if they were the facts. What assumptions are we making? What assumptions are being spoken by us and shared with others that is the language of defeat? What actions have been performed? What actions have been done? What actions will be done if we continue to speak the language of defeat? You see, the language of defeat has stopped many evangelistic efforts. It's forced unnecessary changes in programs that should not have taken place. It has led to the demise of many successful happenings. So I beg you this morning, I beg you to examine your thoughts, examine your language and your actions, and see if you are living defeated lives because you think thoughts of defeat, because you spread the virus to others with the language of defeat, and it is climaxed with lives that are lived as defeated lives. You see, if we are accustomed to think thoughts of defeat and to use the language of defeat, we will doubtless be defeated. Find a case in Scripture of any one or any group that used the language of defeat, and in every single case, it does not end well. No one can overcome through his or her own power. We will not overcome the language of defeat if we try to do it on our own way, by our own means. Man cannot direct himself properly. Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23. However, through faith in the blood and the word of Jesus, obedience to the faith and dedication to the faith, a Christian can overcome. That's the message of Romans 3, verses 23 through 26. My plea to you this morning is to look at all of the actions, all of the programs, all of the things going on in the body of Christ, and ask yourself if we are speaking the language of defeat. If we are taking some facts that exist, assuming some things about those facts, stating those assumptions as if they are the facts, and spreading that toxic language to others that will then lead to actions, changes that are not needed, or to a lack of changes that are needed, that is leading us to a demise. The language of defeat will lead us to be defeated. But all we need to change is one aspect: our thinking, our talking, or our actions, and we can influence the other two. This morning, if you've been speaking the language of defeat and you have not given your life to Christ because of it, we beg you, we plead with you to consider the language of defeat. Set it aside, come to Christ this morning, dedicate your life to Him, give a life of full service, surrendered to the Lord and His cause. If we can assist you in any way this morning, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.